My name is Ana Célia Castro. I am the director of the Colégio Brasileiro de Altos Estudos, and I'm also the president of FOBREAVE, which is the Brazilian Forum for Advanced Studies that connects 12 different universities, university-based institutes for advanced studies, and also 2 non-university-based institutes of advanced study. Before giving the floor to Professor Carlos Frederico Leão da Rocha, I would like to say some words that you will not find nor in GDP, nor in ChatGPT, nor in Google. And the things that I want to say is, I want to introduce in another completely different way this incredible woman who is Mariana Mazzucato. And first of all, she's a very faithful friend. She has 4 children, and with the children, she's a lioness. I can't tell you. And her children are Leon, Nicole, Lúcia e Sofia. And, and you know that this book, The Value of Everything, O Valor de Tudo, is dedicated to the children. And this is because, actually, they are the value of everything. And I also want to tell you that she bakes. She's a wonderful cooker. And she does several different things. And I have the impression that these are the hidden reasons for the Pope Francisco had invited her to be his consultant. So now I can pass the floor to Professor Carlos Frederico Leão da Rocha, who is the director of the Institute of Economics, and I have the pleasure to have him here. And I thank you very much. Thank him very much.
Well, thank you, Ana Célia. I'm going to read something here about Mariana. Mariana is professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College of London, where she's the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She has won many international prizes. And I will mention 2 major works by Mariana that I have read. The first one is an excellent book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public and Private Sector Myths, where she explains in language accessible to non-economists the complexity of the innovation process and the need to establish innovative networks to achieve success. She emphasizes the importance of policy in addressing these issues to promote innovation. Based on solid empirical evidence, Mariana argues that state intervention in the organization of innovative networks has been a rule in the United States. Thus, not only have free lunches been brought up from technical progress, but knowledge has been given to promote American industry. In Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, Mariana teaches us about mission-oriented innovation policies. Mariana is also an advisor to the Brazilian government and has helped us to design our current industrial policy. So it is a pleasure to present Madam Mariana.
Thank you so much. Is it Fred or Carlos?
Fred.
Fred. So should we do it without the microphone? I feel like rimbomba. In Italian say rimbomba. Is it better without?
No,
it's better with.
He's recording.
Let's do a test. It's better with?
Try the other one. Maybe this one.
No, this is fine. Yeah? I feel like Taylor Swift. Okay. Okay. So while you're here, I want to embrace this woman who is one of the most generous, wise mothers of us all, mother of the earth.
Yes,
She mothered my child, one of my many children, who came back loving you. And last night she welcomed me in her home with all her friends. And I compared her, Ana Celia, to in the 18th century, the women who would have these wonderful parties with the public intellectuals. But in her house, it's only public intellectuals who care. So they're under attack. Anyway, thank you so much for organizing this, yeah? So I have good news and bad news. The good news is I decided to change the talk because what, is this okay? I just have to stay put? I'm Italian, so I need to move. No? I stay put, okay. I just spent a month, no, not a month, 2 weeks plus 2 weeks, but separate, writing my new book on the common good. So the good news is you're the first audience who hears a bit about the new book, but I've mixed it with the old stuff. It's a bit of a minestrone soup. The bad news is I had a crazy day yesterday giving lots of talks, began this morning at 9, and we just ran the best workshop on public sector procurement. Compras públicas, it's Spanish, but must be something similar in Portuguese, for 3 hours. Some of you were there. So I was very tired. I went home, not home, Copacabana, Hilton, sort of home, and had a caipirinha because I felt like I was going to die. I was so tired, I had to have a drink. So the bad news is the talk might be a bit less rational than you were hoping. But no, to be honest, it helped. Because, in fact, I want to also welcome my team, including Sarah Doyle, Manuel, Fernando. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yay! Who am I missing? Yeah. Eduardo, where's Eduardo? I don't see. Anyway, he's here somewhere. Ciao, Eduardo. Because we're actually here for different reasons, both to give this talk and to be with my friend Ana Celia, but also the work that we've been doing with the government. And I'm so honored to have Verena, who I've been speaking to now for a couple years, and Gabriela here in the government. And we just had a workshop on procurement, but really we're here with the team because we've been trying to help the government, like different governments, change how they not only think, but do things like procurement, grants, loans, state-owned enterprises, but especially the interministerial coordination that any government needs if it wants to go in a direction, right? Because growth has not only a rate, but a direction. And it's that directionality which the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which I set up 6 years ago, really dedicates itself to. The idea is that we need new economic thinking. The old economic thinking got us into this mess. We need to then try to implement those ideas in a humble way, listening, working with, not at, places. Learn from the ground and bring it back to the theory. We call this practice-based theorizing. But especially the kind of new training, the new education we need inside the civil service is critical, no? We need a new mindset, a new culture, away from just fixing market failures, for those in the room who are economists, towards shaping and creating a very different type of economy that's inclusive, sustainable, and so on. And this concept of mission orientation, which has taken off, even Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has tried to adopt it, for me was always just an example. What does it mean to redesign policies to actually focus on outcomes, like the Sustainable Development Goals, turning them into missions that require not only the interministerial coordination, but also the intersectoral coordination. So instead of thinking of sectors, think of challenges and get all the sectors to change, to innovate, to invest, to train workers in that direction. And I will be speaking a bit about that. But the new thinking, the reason I've been writing this book on the common good, is I've sort of come to the conclusion that none of this is possible unless we actually start talking much more explicitly about what does good even mean, yeah? From, political philosophy, Aristotle onwards, big debate on the common good. And I was very attracted actually recently by learning and thinking a bit more about political philosophy, how much more philosophers have thought about the how than economists. In philosophy, the relational, how I value you, and if you value me, and if we build a community, yeah, that matters as much as where we're going. No? So the telos, the goal for Aristotle, was as important as the polis, the community. Of course, in Aristotle's time, they excluded so many people, the women, the slaves. So this is not about glorifying the old Greek philosophers, but challenging economics with a big debate in political philosophy where the concept of the good was an objective, where the how matters as much as the what, the how we relate one to another. We were talking about it not last night in the Amazon. It's very important. You don't work at the Amazon and bring the indigenous communities to your table, and you even challenge me on the concept of voice. You let them steer and govern and own the agenda, but also value their knowledge. And if you don't, it's all bullshit, no? Anyway, so this is why I've been thinking a lot about why the concept of outcomes orient. Can you hear me with this microphone? It's okay? Ah, amazing. Outcomes orientation and mission orientation needs a concept of the good that is not like the public good, which is a correction for something that's lacking in the private sector, but actually an objective where the how we work together on the intellectual property rights, on, again, procurement, on public-private partnerships, all that stuff really matters to get right ex ante instead of picking up the mess ex post. This is what happens when I randomly start telling people why I changed the talk. Okay, so I need to start moving. Okay, anyway, so thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Ana Célia for organizing it. And again, the work that I'm very interested in Brazil, because there's such a focus on the ecological transition, is what does it then mean to get this right? So the talk is really a mix of the mission-oriented approach and some of the early thinking I've been doing on the common good. But to get the proper talk on the common good, I'll come back in 3 years when the book is finished. And really the point is, you've probably seen this cartoon, it circulates around, that we're so stuck going from crisis to crisis to crisis in reactive mode. And of course these crises are connected, right? We know now from the science that the COVID pandemic was in fact related to how badly we've treated our environment, and the wider word of the environment in terms of the ecological and the biodiversity behind it. But also this extreme kind of stagnation, the lack of urgency that we seem to have with any of these social problems. We don't treat them like when there's a war. When there's wars, which I don't like, unfortunately war is back, no one says, oh yeah, in 2030 we'll win the war. No, you say we're gonna win it now. And there's all sorts of things that happen in wartime. We transform industries into wartime industries. If you look at what happened in World War II, the trade unions in many countries were critical for transforming, for example, the automobile industry into a war machinery. And it required also lots of negotiation between the different parties. But the point is, with war, which I dislike, I don't like the war metaphor, people want to win. So it's not surprising that we use tools like the Defense Production Procurement Act to procure in all the technologies and the goods and the services that are required to win a war. But in peacetime, we're very slow, there's inertia, there's stagnation. We talk about things like climate change, inclusion, and equality, but it really doesn't move, it doesn't transform, it's patchy. There's a bit of change here and there, there's projects, cute little projects around climate change, but it's not systemic and it's not aligned. And you would have thought that COVID would have woken us up, right? Because there was so much excess death. People died in excess of what you would normally have because we were so badly prepared. We didn't actually fund our global health systems. A lot of the deaths happened precisely because the virus was able to circulate in such ways because many parts of the world continued to be very weak in terms of the health system. If COVID had begun in Africa and not in China, we would all have been worse off. So you would have thought that at least some of the COVID recovery would have made sure that we had a much more equal and equitable global health system. Did we wake up? No. I mean, you tell me, people here who work with health, do we have stronger health systems today than before? No. We had terrible test and trace, so the digital governance, the infodemic side of COVID, we discovered we were very badly prepared. In the UK, we paid Deloitte, and don't laugh too much, I found out that your missions today are being done by McKinsey. Anyway, Deloitte was paid 1.5 million a day to do test and trace and failed miserably because the government wasn't ready for the technological test and trace system. We failed to deliver personal protection equipment. We were talking today to Carlos Gardella, where many of the people who died early on in COVID were health workers, the people trying to protect us who didn't even have masks. It's a crime, right? And we didn't have the industrial capacity to produce masks, which are not very complex. Anyway, I could go on, and it should have been a massive wake-up call, but it wasn't. And this idea that actually we're so unprepared and reactive and not investing and all the things we need is also very stark if you look at what's happening with the debate inside the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, the 169 targets beneath them. Verena was meeting today with Cristina Reis, our good friend who really cares about the SDGs for Brazil. And you have even the president of the World Bank, the new guy from Citibank, Ajay Banga, and Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General, saying, what's going on? We are not actually moving towards them. We're even going backwards. And they're calling for action. And there's a big summit this summer, actually in September, called the Summit of the Future, where the UN says, what are we going to do? We had these 2030 goals, no hunger, no poverty, climate, life below our oceans, and it's just not happening. We're not moving in that direction. So there's a real call to action. And you have all these beautiful words like the common agenda. No, this is a word that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres from Portugal, has come up with, saying that to achieve these goals, 17 goals, you see them here, we need to treat them as like a common problem and have collective action. And he uses this beautiful word, a common agenda, but it sounds good and he means well, but that really requires a different way to even think of our collective problems, collective action, systemic action, and I will soon say the common good and not just a correction of something the public sector should do. And you know, the reason I'm so proud and honored to be working with some of the wonderful civil servants in this room, even those who forget to charge their phone before the, just kidding, is that in this country, you have actually put some goals at the center. Usually what happens is we continue in the old way, now the old way of doing finance, the old way of doing the economy, and when we talk about goals, they are in some faraway place like the Department of the Environment or the Department of Health. By putting the ecological transformation in the finance ministry, Minister Haddad, it's already a radical step. It doesn't matter what you think of the finance ministry or anything. The fact it goes to the center instead of the periphery is a very important step. And what does it then mean to even treat industrial strategy at the center, to see it as a new way to grow, but to get all the different industries to move in a direction, a common agenda, using the Secretary General's words, it means really doing capitalism differently. So we know this is not necessarily happening today in Brazil, but the fact that this is at least being talked about and it's being put at the center, and it's causing a bit of disruption. Even when we were walking on the beach, where were we? No, there's no beach. We were in Brasilia. What was it, a lake? What is that? A lake, okay. And we were planning, how do we coordinate? What does it mean for putting the goal of an ecological transformation above, and really asking what it means for all the different departments to work together differently, for all the different sectors that are used to being, easily lobbying their way up to be considered special. What does it mean to disrupt the status quo by actually having a goal-oriented economy where those goals are at the center and not in a cute little side where we just go pet the dog, give it a bone, and go back to doing the old way of doing capitalism. So, none of this makes any sense unless we really go to the root of the problem, how we do government, how we do business, how we do finance, how these three different actors work together with civil society. Leonardo and I have been talking a long time. I've learned a lot from you, actually, of the work of Karl Polanyi. If you've read The Great Transformation, one of the best books ever, they've just relaunched it, by the way. I don't know if they also republished it here, 1944. Karl Polanyi was so important because he saw the market itself as an outcome of how we organize our public, our private institutions, how they have tension between them, civil society, labor unions. We all know labor unions, trade unions, which I strangely don't hear enough about, actually, in Brazil. That's kind of weird. I just thought of that. We don't. In none of the meetings I've ever been in Brazil has there been a trade unionist. Okay, I'm not going to think about that. That's going to get me into a different conversation. But, labor unions are why we have the weekends, why we have holidays, why we have many industries where people don't die because a rock falls on your head if you're a construction worker. No, people died for all these things that we benefit from. And that idea of the market itself as an outcome of all these tensions, the movements, the counter-movements, the relationships between all these different actors requires us actually then to pay attention today if we want to solve these big problems like climate, like health pandemics, like the digital divide. What does it mean for focusing not on the market or the non-market? I disagree with some economists. Even our lecture last night, we were talking with Giovanni Dozzi, who said some things should not even be in the market. I think it's different to say some things we need to govern in a completely different way so that the market itself is transformed and we don't confuse the market with business, right? How we govern business, how we govern corporate governance, how we govern the public institutions, how they work together determines the kind of market we end up with. Anyway, so going to the root of the problem of why we've ended up with crisis after crisis after crisis, biodiversity, water, climate, financial, all related, requires us really to rethink all these different institutions. And a lot of my work has been about rethinking government, away from just fixing market failures, towards actively shaping and creating an economic system that delivers for what we want, like a purpose-oriented economy. And the fact that at worst we talk about government get out of the way, but that's not really when adults are in the room, but at best, it's fixing market failures, or if you're a bit smarter, system failures, or innovation system failures, it's part of the problem. So whether it's the need for the government to invest in things like public goods because of positive externalities, or correct for the bad things like negative externalities, make up for the lack of investment in small, medium enterprises due to asymmetric information, so on and so forth. The fact that at best we can talk about government as fixing stuff means that we shouldn't be surprised that it's kind of rubbish sometimes, that it's too little too late, it's reactive, it's patchy, maybe, as we were saying today, it doesn't even have the expertise to do outcomes-oriented procurement, but it's not rocket science why that is. If you think government is there to patch things up, the skills that we think we need in government are literally bandages, yeah? If you look at the curriculum of the MPA, Masters in Public Administration, globally, it's just boring. Whereas the MBA, B for business, now Master's in Business Administration, all these sexy classes like strategic management, organizational behavior, decision sciences, sexy titles of the textbooks like Rejuvenating the Mature Corporation. Why? Because when corporations become too big and bureaucratic, they might be slower. They might be more vertical and bureaucratic. So they must rejuvenate. And you have the case study methodology at Harvard Business School, because they say we need to learn what works, what doesn't in businesses, the multi-divisional company, blah, blah, blah. But that's only because we admit that the private sector creates value. So we want to organize it better, which of course we should. But when we think of the government just as fixing stuff, it's not surprising we don't have those cool courses, because you don't need strategic management, organizational behavior, long-term, strategic, flexible, agile planning, able to embrace uncertainty if all you're doing is putting bandages, no? And a lot of the work, again, that I'm starting to work on is actually tackling the way that good, I'm just going to give you a bit of flavors of what the new book is about, but I'm mainly going to talk about the mission stuff and why it should create discomfort in us. The fact that even the notion of the public good has been framed as a market failure is part of the problem. Public good, 2 words. One is good. Good is just about correcting for something because of the non-rival, non-excludable characteristics, so the private sector doesn't produce those things, and so the government needs to come in and fill the gap. That's why we talk about financial gaps, like $7 trillion for the SDGs, about $4 trillion of which is just on the climate-related bits of it, of which $4 trillion is in the developing parts of the world. So it's like a gap, like a hole, as though there's like a hole we have and we throw money into it, and somehow that's going to solve all the problems. So that idea of a financial gap, as opposed to what? Restructuring finance so the quality, not just the quantity, is moving in the direction to actually solve these problems. It's almost impossible to think like that if we think of it as just a correction. And if you look at the theory of the commons by Elinor Ostrom and all that very important work, what's interesting is even there it's correcting for failures, but not market failures, government failure. So, even though it's very important work, the work on the commons, and I don't dismiss it, the fact that you have on the one side the public good, correcting for a market failure, and the commons, correcting for a government failure, almost by design doesn't make us think of how to have better government, better business, better relationship to solve those problems, so we don't fall into the trap to think it's all just about community engagement, bottom up, as important as community engagement is, and I'll come back to that. But if by design we're not challenging government to be better and to do things right from the beginning, because it's been framed as a government failure, we have a problem. The second big problem in terms of rethinking capitalism is how we've gotten stuck in thinking about business. Yeah, business is important, of course, in capitalism, unlike feudalism. But since the 1980s, we've gotten quite stuck with thinking that corporate governance is about maximizing shares. Yes, there's other parts of the world that are driven by stakeholder value, like in Scandinavia, they have trade unionists on the board. But this concept of stakeholder value should be a provocation to admit what we know, which is that there's varieties of capitalism, that we should indeed be understanding very different ways to not only think about corporate governance, but how companies work with others, right? So stakeholder value should be about creating value differently between all those different actors, and I'll come back to this later. But the concept of stakeholder value, this is Larry Fink, has been a bit captured by the kind of Davos jet set crowd, where it becomes almost like doing good by thinking about how actors like workers or communities should share in the benefits of value created by business, as opposed to really rethinking, is it only business that creates value? What about public institutions as value creators, not just redistributors, facilitators, market fixers, de-riskers, enablers, all these boring, boring, boring words. Labor, you don't have to read Marx to know that labor creates value. What does that mean for workers not only getting a bit of extra at the end, but really owning a share from the beginning? Different ownership structures, whether it's cooperatives, but also having a voice. I know you've challenged me on the concept of voice, but let me be lazy now and say it. Have a voice at the table of how to steer an economy. It's quite of a, it's been kind of used to, I don't want to say greenwashing or social washing, but it's not really out there as a concept that even Scandinavia is not bragging about the fact that they've practiced it. It's just hidden. Every now and then it comes up, but it's not challenging anyone. And in fact, one of the biggest, this is older data, one of the biggest signals that we have a problem here is seen by just how much value that's created in business is not shared, for sure. It's not even reinvested back in to the system. It's actually financialized. So people like Bill Lazonick and other scholars have looked at this problem of share buybacks and dividend payouts. Over 7 trillion in the last decade has been used just to buy back shares, boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. Something that I wrote about in The Value of Everything, the book you quoted, as something that the physiocrats, the economists in the 1700s, were already worried about. They looked at the landlord class and looked at all the money that was extracted out of the system and called the landlords the sterile class, no? Because the system was at risk of not reproducing. And somehow we've forgotten to actually do our national accounting, like GDP, differentiating profits from rents. We confuse, the thesis of the book, The Value of Everything, was that we're confusing price with value. So as long as something has a price, like a fee for a financial sector, we don't actually ask, is it producing value? Is it creating it? Is it extracting it? Is it destroying it? That requires a very different conversation. And the third, these are just very quickly going through some big dysfunctionalities. The financial sector itself, not just the business, so the business sector is financialized, and the financial sector is financialized, basically reinvesting in itself. This is a big problem also in Brazil. So in the UK where I live, 80% of finance goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. That's fire. So the climate is on fire in terms of climate change, but also our financial sector, which has really just been kind of financing itself. This graph is an old one by Andy Haldane, who looked at how the financial intermediation sector was outpacing the rest of the economy, not because it was financing the rest of the economy, but doing what Hyman Minsky talked about in terms of money manager capitalism. And you see this in terms of global financial assets, just how much they've increased. This is actually an old figure, but you just see this, again, that the financialization of both the real economy and the financial sector itself is something that needs a lot more attention. And every time there's a crisis, we just think it's okay to give out loans in a system that is already so indebted, not only in terms of the global south, which is paying more in interest payments than are being paid for climate or social spending, but also literally the private sector. If we just give out loans during COVID when there's lockdowns and don't pay attention to the fact that we are just increasing the level of debt, or this is from the UK, where every time there's a problem, we think it's okay just to make it easier for people to buy houses by giving them loans, easy loans, without making sure the income that's being earned by those households is going to be enough to even pay back the loans, which we strangely worry about for governments, where we say too much debt, but for the private sector, we seem not to almost look at it. In the UK, the level of private debt to disposable income is at the level it was just before the financial crisis. And you see this just in terms of how much the rise, if you want, of non-real economy sector finance has increased over time, so this rise in mortgages without actually increasing the real income potential that, of course, is necessary to pay that back. And so what I've tried to do in the different books, and this I'm just kind of giving you a bit of the big overview, is to say, unless we both tackle those problems head on and admit that the market is an outcome of how we organize government, how we organize business, how we organize finance, how these different sectors interrelate. And of course, I didn't go through it now because of limited time, but labor unions and civil society organizations have always been at the center of putting pressure on the system to also move in the right direction. Then we're not gonna change, because we think that somehow these are just deterministic problems like climate, inequality. Yes, we care about it, but unless we rethink the governance structures of these different institutions and the relationships between them, then not much will change. So I will mainly focus on some of the recent, or not even recent anymore, but the practice, when I said practice-based theorizing of my institute, where we've tried to put into action some of the ideas from the entrepreneurial state. In other words, the state not as a lender of last resort, but an investor of first resort, a market shaper, not a market fixer, and then translating that into policy, mission-oriented policies, but also this idea that underlying this ability to steer the economy in a goal-oriented way, we need to challenge the idea of what does good even look like, and who decides? Who's at the table to even decide where we're going? And again, in a country like Brazil, where there's all these different policies, including some of the architects here, the new industrial policy at the center, trying to bring together this idea of kind of different mission areas, the growth acceleration plan, which is more about infrastructure, the ecological transformation plan, the state transformation agenda. You know, the fact that this country has so much ambition makes it even more important to get some of these details right, so we don't fall back into thinking we can just put these sexy words, whether it's mission or industrial policy or growth acceleration plan, without really rethinking the governance of our public institutions, our private institutions, and their relationships. And you know, just quickly, I mean, and I'm going to use this new framing that I've been thinking about to organize some of the remaining thoughts that I have. This idea that the how matters as much as the what really has been driving a lot of my recent thinking. The fact that we actually need to have what the Secretary General calls a common agenda. You know, what does that actually mean for questioning? What are our common objectives? Where do they come from? Like the Sustainable Development Goals, what does it mean to have that directionality at the center of the governance of these institutions, public, private, finance? What does it mean to actually really appreciate the fact that value itself is a product of those collective interactions? What does it mean to share those resources? If we talk about things like collective intelligence, are we actually sharing knowledge? Or is this like a parasitic relationship where value is created, knowledge is created? Think of AI today, huge amount of potential, but the ownership structures, the governance structures remain kind of under the radar, and we fall into the trap of talking about these as great new opportunities. Some people worried, some people pro, but not really questioning the governance of those different interactions, and this issue of co-creation and participation. So this kind of wheel, this dashboard, to me became important for holding the system accountable along the way towards thinking of an outcomes-oriented economy that could tackle these different crises, the SDGs. I'll come to the missions point in a minute. But how do we actually start to develop a new type of economics that explicitly, in an objective-oriented way, not a correction-oriented way, talks about this common agenda and the common good, and thinking about the purpose and directionality of the system, purpose-oriented economy, co-creation and participation, collective learning and knowledge sharing, access for all and reward sharing, and making sure that we actually have transparency and accountability, so this dashboard is being a thorn in the side of the system instead of just a cozy set of words that we all think makes everything cute. Sorry, this is a funny situation where I had the opportunity to go speak about this paper that I wrote on the common good with the Pope. And first he looked at me and he said, Mariana, me dicen que no eres muy religiosa. But then he said, but you have 4 children. So you must not love abortion too much. But anyway, but it was actually an honor to talk to the Pope, because I think he's actually more rigorous than many economists about this notion of the common good. He talks about the principle of subsidiarity, which is that the decisions, the more local and practical they are, and the more we focus on how they impact what he calls the preferential option for the poor, making sure that every policy is looked at in how it affects the most vulnerable segment of the population. These, they're flavors of what it means to actually have a bit of rigor, holding a system accountable, that we're actually, walking the talk of this concept of the common good. And so what, you've given me a huge amount of time, so I will still speak a bit. But what I wanted to go through was a bit of a quick flavor of what it means for me to really kind of rethink the economics and the policy making, but those governance structures, from market fixing to market shaping, from shareholder value to stakeholder value, to bringing this notion of the common good to the center, so the direction is clear, but also that we hold the system accountable around those kind of 5 pillars, in terms of what it means for redesigning our policies to be outcomes-oriented, redesigning the tools and the institutions to make sure they're not part of the problem. We were at BNDES all day. Yeah, BNDES is great. It's a public bank. But in many parts of the world, the public banks are part of the problem. Yeah, where I'm from in Italy, we just give out money to sectors that need help. Is that helping the system move in a good direction, or are we just excusing the inertia by transferring money from one part of the system to another? Of course, we need patient long-term finance. That's what public banks provide. But unless they are explicitly designed to move an economy with a direction, more inclusion, more sustainability, then they're part of the problem. They can actually make things worse. What are the dynamic capabilities that we need within our public institutions and the private institutions to work better together? And if we just outsource it all to others, like the McKinseys, which, again, I hear Brazil has just paid a huge amount of money to work on the missions, that's part of the problem, not part of the solution. The new social contract, it's not true? It's true. Oh, did you not know this? Oh, sorry. Is it me just telling you for the first time? Okay. Really? No one knows? It's just, oh, it was a secret? Oh, later. Oh, shit. Maybe I wasn't supposed to talk about it. Anyway, a new social contract, putting the deal of the New Deal at the center of a transformation, unpicking what does a deal look like? What do we even mean by a deal? There can be a good deal, a bad deal. An ecosystem can be parasitic, symbiotic. Do we know the difference? Biologists do. The first thing a biologist will do when they look at an ecosystem is name it. Mutualistic, symbiotic, parasitic, predator-prey. Do we have any idea whether our contracts are symbiotic, mutualistic contracts? Not if we just think of partnership and ecosystem as a neutral word. And this issue of co-creation and participation, if you think of how much distrust there is right now in the world, and, hey, Marcela, ciao. How much distrust there is in the world, why we have this rise of populism. It's not that people are stupid because they're voting for Trump. No comment. But it is also because they're very dissatisfied. There has been so many people that have genuinely been left behind and just either vote for so-called anarchist parties, which actually are often masking feudalist tendencies. In Italy, we had this. The Partito delle Cinque Stelle masked itself as, oh, the politicians, they're all corrupt. Business is all corrupt. And this is like a movement from below. But if you look underneath, it's actually more hierarchical, more misogynistic, like Podemos was in Spain. But if you look at who's voting for these parties, it's genuinely people who are dissatisfied. And so what do we do about that instead of just criticizing, oh, they're crazy, why are they voting for these crazy parties? How do we actually bring people to the table to help design these policies from the beginning? What does it mean to have true participation so the policies that we think are so good for everyone are informed by the actual experience on the ground? Which is what the Pope, and I'm not religious, he's right, calls the principle of subsidiarity. No? So co-creation, participation, and I'm glad I have this slide because I'm not going to finish the slide, so this is basically the summary of what I'll talk about. But you know, the idea that actually the how matters as much as the what. If we don't have those participatory mechanisms, then actually the how we're going towards the outcome is part of the problem, because it just reproduces a technocratic, elitist, but also condescending, often even mean way of thinking about how communities are part of an economy or not. And that's why, of course, the welfare areas like care and so on remain peripheral to when we talk about growth and innovation, industrial strategy. The things that matter, you know, that have to do with poverty and hunger and care are on the side. So a lot of what the participation and co-creation should be doing is bringing those concerns about well-being and welfare to the center, and having those concerns about well-being inform how we innovate and so on. So this dial that I've been working on for this common good approach, for me, has just been helping me think, how can we hold the system accountable so we don't romanticize government or the mission or the vision, but make sure that at each step of the way, the how, again, matters as much as the what. And, you know, the point about the directionality and purpose, remind me how much time we have, because my time here is saying I have a huge amount of time left, but when do you want to, when should I finish to begin? 10 minutes. Oh my God, okay. Very good, okay. So I'll just go quickly. In fact, I could even stop, to be honest, because I've told you everything. But the mission-oriented policies is something that with the Institute we've been thinking a lot about, because it should be disrupting this market failure fixing framing. Mission, the word, is not just vision, mission, plan. It's about saying if you care about an outcome, what does it mean to transform the way that all the different actors interact in an ex-ante way from the beginning towards solving the problem. And the reason I wrote Mission Economy was that the moon landing would never happen today if we organized today our policies around the moon like we organize climate change, health, or digital divide. In other words, the moon landing began with a completely different vocabulary from facilitation, enabling, and fixing. Kennedy said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. Already there, bang, different. It means you welcome experimentation, you welcome uncertainty, you admit you're going to screw up along the way, right? Because you're doing it because it's hard. So we were talking today about how much risk averseness there is in the civil service and why that's part of the reason they go to the consultants. Well, then admit that what you're doing will require risk and experimentation, no? And what's so interesting about the moon landing was because they said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy, they actually then also took a lot of care in how the different actors in the system would kind of embrace that underlying uncertainty. And let me just come back to that. The way that they partnered, they had to change it. We had a 3-hour workshop on procurement today. The compras públicas, often 30% of government budgets, and they changed it from cost plus, just worrying about prices and costs, towards fixed price, challenge-oriented procurement with incentives for quality improvement and innovation. And they realized they needed to do that in order to stimulate the innovation, the investment, the training in the private sector. And in a country like Brazil, which has low private investment, we always obsess about public investment, but low private investment, to the point that Luciano Coutinho, our friend who used to run BNDES, used to say to me, Mariana, Brazil is capitalism without capitalists, to actually stimulate the private sector investment to put conditionality in the public sector procurement towards a direction that requires investment in innovation is what NASA realized. They even had clauses of no excess profits, no rents. You can earn profits, no problem, but not in excess of what you're actually doing, because it's collective value creation. And they, by stimulating so much innovation across nutrition, materials, electronics, in an outcomes-oriented way, we ended up with all this growth, not because they worried about growth, but because technological change was required in order to meet the many, many different homework problems they had along the way. So camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, and so on. This point, by the way, is critical, because otherwise we fall into the trap of thinking productivity is the mission, growth is the mission, jobs are the mission. What NASA did was focus on the problems. How would the astronauts go to the toilet? Literally. How would they eat? How would they move? And the solutions to those problems created technological change, which is central to productivity changes, which is central to growth changes. So by breaking down climate change into not only a mission, a clear mission, net zero, but thinking of all the changes that have to occur in an outcomes-oriented way, how we build, how we move, how we eat, and so on, it's, that's the kind of mind shift. And so this is, many of you have probably seen this, but from Challenge, the challenge was just a space race, beat the Russians, turning it into a clear mission to the moon and back, getting many different sectors involved, not a sectoral approach, but a multi-sectoral approach in order to achieve a goal where those sectors need to invest, change, innovate, so that you actually meet the goal. And the transformation of tools like procurement, but in the modern day, grants, loans, subsidies, bailouts during COVID to stimulate that innovation towards the goal itself. So break down any of the SDGs, whether it's climate change, clean oceans, health and well-being. The missions, of course, have to be negotiated on the ground. It will be very different in different regions, different countries, or at the city level. But this idea that usually what happens is the reverse. Take that mission map and literally pin it on its head. So you have a lot of projects falling on the head of the ministers. That's what's happening today in Europe. We have a big recovery program called the Next Gen EU Recovery. The member states have to come up with climate projects in order to get money. It's very easy to come up with a bunch of projects. So we have all these climate projects, digital projects, health projects, but the sum is not greater than the parts, because all these different projects aren't actually getting aligned in any way that helps to shift and transform the economy itself. And even worse, when you don't have a mission statement, industrial strategy, of course, goes back to the old one, where those different sectors start to become the mission. Agribusiness in Brazil, or even automotive in Brazil, or life sciences in the UK, or even the creative sector. It might sound sexy, it's still just a sector, right? What are we actually trying to build in an economy? What's the purpose of the economy, and how can we use all the different tools to meet it? Let me just skip ahead here. The missions we've been arguing for a long time need to be above any government ministry, because that's also what was interesting in NASA. They realized their own bureaucracy was badly structured. The different departments in NASA weren't even communicating. They realized this, by the way, after they had a huge fire where 3 astronauts died. One was Gus Grissom, and the day he died, he yelled, "How the beep are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 departments?" Because they couldn't hear what was being said in Mission Control Room. That's why NASA changed its bureaucracy. It transformed it into a much more agile, flexible one. But the idea of having missions on top of the different ministries and asking what it actually means if you have a climate mission for health ministry, for transport ministry, for the development ministry, for the finance ministry. Health and well-being is not for the Department of Health, like climate is not for the Department of Energy. So we've also been, thinking, what does it mean for the Amazon? But, this isn't enough. It's not enough just to have a statement for the Amazon, but it does mean that it should disrupt how those sectors currently are working in those places? And what are the principles of justice and equity that should be, you see here in the work we're doing in Barbados, the principles of justice and equity in a country like Barbados, which was at the center of the slave trade, making sure that there's principles of justice and equity in the very design, not only of the mission statement, but in the different ways that those actors work together, has been very important, well, in any country. In Australia, where we were just with Sarah, the labor unions there say that, justice for labor has to be its own mission, but also a principle running across those different missions. But let me just skip ahead here a bit. The tools themselves are very important, which I mentioned that, the how matters as much as the what. The how we actually design the procurement itself, it's not only important for it to be outcomes oriented, but there's places like in Colombia today where they're trying to democratize procurement. Often the services themselves that are being procured in are being designed in such a way that the people who have access to those services have had no say in what their own experience is. So some of the work we've done in London recently has been very interesting. Adult social care and housing estates in Camden. We worked with Camden, the part of London where our university is, to actually design the procurement for adult social care to be informed by those people who've been responsible for the care, but also the people who've been cared for. So democratizing, not only having outcomes orientation, but informing it by those who are experiencing that. My friend Jennifer Palka has written a wonderful book about how digital governance and the kind of the web platforms of many governments are designed in such a way by people who've never even accessed the services like welfare payments in the United States, that then people are using the web platform of the government to access. And she says in order to have a serious DPI, digital public infrastructure, it needs to be informed by those who are actually experiencing those services. In Brazil, we've been thinking a lot about the school meal program because the kind of hunger, very broad mission, what it actually means for designing, again, outcomes-oriented procurement for something, not the moon landing, but lunch, school lunch. If we're actually very ambitious about the structure of these welfare institutions like lunch in schools, learning from the experience of Sweden, where they said lunch has to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. So the procurement of the biggest restaurant chain in the world, which is the number of meals every day that the public school system provides on this planet, what does it mean to actually turn that into an innovation instrument? It's very important, I think, as an example, also because Brazil in some ways is leading on this, but it's an example of where we break down that difference between the welfare state and the innovation state, taking problems like meals, hunger, schools, public education, and schools delivered through public education by actually having an innovation goal. So it's not just lunch, it's healthy, tasty, and sustainable lunch. It means that the supply chain of those that are providing that are not only local in terms of local product requirements, but they have to innovate and invest and train and use repurpose, recycle, reuse kind of technology throughout that, which helps to also diversify the economy, right? Because you actually have an innovation goal at the center. Another thing that we've been quite inspired by in Brazil in that same line of bringing together the welfare state with the innovation state is what's happening today with one of the missions, which is the Health Economy Industrial Complex, because it's very explicitly designed in such a way where it's the public health goals are not seen as just a welfare goal, but it's at the center of how the industrial economy health complex is designed. So the innovation side and the access side, so health for all, is about access, but how the intellectual property rights are structured, how Fiocruz works with the health department, how that partnership is structured to have equity and access at the center, is actually quite rare. You might think this is normal, but usually what happens is the US system, where you have health innovation here, $40 billion a year, and then health access somewhere else, so the people are not actually getting the goods and the services that they paid for. The pharmaceutical industry can just charge whatever price they want. The intellectual patents are abused, and it's not aligned. We're not a goal-oriented way where the structure of production and innovation has those issues of equity and justice at the center. Let me just move on a bit quicker. Another very important tool is the public banks. I mentioned BNDES, very important, but actually there's plenty of public banks out there, over 20.2 trillion in the world, but these funds are not aligned in any sort of outcomes-oriented way. There's just a lot of things being funded, basically. And so we've been thinking a lot about how this issue of directionality could potentially catalyze what the Secretary General calls the SDG multiplier, by having a much clearer alignment between the MDBs, the multilateral development banks like CAF, IDB, in Latin America, with the SDGs, and then having a much more clear alignment between the MDBs and the NDBs, the national banks, 20.2 trillion, and having much stronger conditionality between those national public banks and the private sector. So in Germany, the reason there's green steel is that there was a very strong condition attached between their public bank and the steel sector, which had to lower the material content of production in order even to get 1 penny. But that requires that conditionality, that reciprocity, that symbiotic system instead of a parasitic system, upsetting the status quo where the sector used to think it could just get a loan. All of a sudden, it has to actually invest and transform its production structure in order to get 1 penny. So that outcomes orientation designed into the loan program itself, instead of just giving out money and picking up the pieces kind of ex post. Let me just move on quickly. The new social contract is something that we've been working a lot on. You know, in some countries, they have a lot of money that's being given out, but sometimes they wake up and really embed some of that conditionality in the social contract, but that's very rare. And so we've been learning what works, what doesn't, what are good examples. In the United States, the IRA, which you've heard about, is mainly done through the tax code, and everyone's talking about that. But the really interesting thing happening in the US is through the CHIPS Act. There's been strong conditionality in the CHIPS Act, which is $400 billion for the semiconductor companies, because the US wants chip sovereignty. And we, through the Institute, actually help to inform some of these conditions: limited share buybacks, energy efficient supply chains, paying workers a living wage, improving working conditions. They added some other conditions as well. But that idea that, you know, energy efficiency is not just for a climate goal, but it's just what should be demanded of any, if you want, sectoral contract with the government. Just think of water rights. Water is usually owned by the state and is given to breweries or given to Coca-Cola, and yet 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled. That's crazy. That would be such an obvious place where you could embed conditionality, that you have access to the water if you, at the very least, recycle the industrial wastewater. Intellectual property rights, they're contracts. They're not rights. You get 17 years of monopoly profits. What should be part of that deal, as opposed to what we actually see, where patents are too wide, they're too strong, they're too upstream, so very badly negotiated, very bad contract, which has been misaligned. Bailouts, even during COVID, we saw that some countries, like in France, this mean-looking guy is the Minister of Finance, they put strong conditions for Air France and Renault. In order to get 1 penny out of the government, they had to commit to reducing carbon emissions, whereas in the UK, we gave £600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. So this is just to say there's so many different ways that these things are done, and by just talking about public-private partnership or talking about, you know, industrial strategy without learning, how do we make sure we do not continue to make the mistakes to think that this is just about kind of, you know, helping business or government, you know, having the ecological stuff on the sidelines and not using every opportunity, whether it's a COVID bailout or a CHIPS Act, to make sure that we're actually transforming and tilting the economy in a particular direction. Partnership with purpose, this is actually very, oops, why is that twice? That's weird. Oh wait, am I going the wrong way? Anyway, in Australia, as I mentioned, Act 2, one of the biggest trade unions, which is trying to inform some of this missions approach, said, we don't want to know anything about missions unless we're very clear about the justice principles, including that first one, First Nations justice, no? Those indigenous communities that were on the land first, what does it mean to embed in the governance structures of the missions principles of this sort? And what's interesting also in Barbados, where we've been working, is the degree to which some of these principles are themselves missions or are cross-cutting all missions is actually where a lot of the debate is. And in Barbados, for example, the idea that identity and valuing who one is and the history of colonization and slavery itself needs to be reckoned with, to the point that Mia Motley says that Redemption Song should be on the national curriculum, Bob Marley's famous song. She says that should both be its own mission to give people that self-worth and identity requires huge amounts of investment in also culture in the wide sense of the word, but also needs to be a cross-cutting issue. Anyway, accountability, I've taken up too much time now, but just to say, this is very much also making sure that the way we value and evaluate whether we are achieving mission accomplished along the way matters. If we continue to think this is about cost-benefit analysis, net present value, as opposed to having much more dynamic valuation for those dynamic spillovers across the economy, additionality, making sure that these public investments are making things happen that otherwise would not have happened, that are causing catalytic multiplier effect instead of just handouts, requires a very different set of metrics in the so-called public evaluation book. In the UK, we call it the Green Book. Sorry, you can barely see anything here. And actually, I've learned a lot from the BBC, which within the BBC, they have metrics that hold the state accountable around public value. So if they're making a documentary, a soap opera, a news show, the BBC holds itself accountable with this idea that they're not there just to crowd out or even crowd in the private sector, but to really deliver what's not being delivered at all. And we've been helping them think and break down this concept of public value into individual value, industry value, societal value. And it's been a very interesting work because it goes beyond this notion of social value, which sometimes has been used to kind of measure whether we are achieving, the right direction. It hasn't, the concept of social value, which was actually used by Tony Blair and the Labour government before, is very much, again, like the notion of stakeholder value in business, kind of ex post, as opposed to ex ante. How do we actually organize relationships to deliver public value differently in the first place, but in so doing, even value the role of that public institution in creating value instead of just redistributing it ex post. Anyway, this work is free on the web. I think wait, these are weird slides. Okay, I've already talked about this. I think I should just finish here because I'm talking too long and I wanted Verena to be able to comment. But just to say, I mentioned that some of the most interesting work that we've been doing as an institute has been at the very local level, at the community level. And the reason it's been more interesting is that it's much easier than to bring different people together. So this idea of participation and co-creation is very important. But it only makes sense if you test out an experiment. We're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy, with new democratic fora where you are truly actually valuing those that are participating with you. And in Camden, at least, one of the tragic situations is we have very high inequality. Of course, you have very high inequality here in Rio as well, or more. But the big transformation was transforming, for example, food banks into food cooperatives. Or if you think of energy communities that are not just doing good for the community, but the communities own the energy that is actually produced. And that idea of a food cooperative instead of a food bank, where the people who are benefiting from the system are actually in charge of the governance, and they have dignity and self-worth and valuing each other, has been something that I don't think that we know how to do very well at the national level. And so learning from these very local experiences, these are just the lists of the missions that the Camden Council came up with in working with people, but bringing resident associations, citizen assemblies to the table to actually design those missions in the first place is something that I think we as economists have nothing to say about, should just shut up and learn about what that true citizen engagement that is not just tokenistic, kind of form-filling means. And this has been, I think, very interesting to the work we've done, as well as, different examples like in Brazil of participatory budgeting. What does that look like? What does it mean to scale those experiences instead of just having them being kind of side? And that new social contract with labor, more important than ever. As I said, I don't hear enough about labor unions in Brazil, but the labor share of global income is at one of the lowest levels it's ever been. And what does it mean actually to learn from, for example, what happened in the US in November, where the United Auto Workers struck. They had a strike against the 3 big automobile companies for the first time in history. Why? Because the green transition was in fact screwing over the workers, as Trump was telling people, because the battery producers were earning a third less than the unionized General Motors workers. And so there was a very big strike to make sure that in fact the workers also in the battery production plants were benefiting from higher wages, good working conditions. But none of these things happen on their own. They actually had to have a strike. There was a struggle. There was a contestation. And we need to remember, again, from Polanyi's work, how important this has always been in order to steer markets in a direction that is actually more just and equitable. But, this is not a harmonious, easy ballet. This means actually embracing what it means to admit that markets are outcomes of public, of private, but also of civil society organizations that have historically, in 200 years, always shifted the capitalist system to go in the right direction. I had a whole section on capabilities, but I don't have time. Just to say that without capacity and capabilities, none of this thing will happen. This is why I set up the Institute. This is why experimenting, having gov labs are very important, safe places for civil servants to test out some of these ideas instead of being blamed as soon as they make a mistake. The reason I wrote The Big Con was precisely because it is a big con. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're just fixing market failures, it's by definition, you won't be investing in the capacity you need, and you will be very scared of any mistake you make. Let me just finish by moving forward, otherwise I will never finish. How many slides did I get? Anyway, changing the theory, the practice, the narrative, the stories we tell. This is why actually the cultural sector is also very important. But that narrative really moving away from this idea of fixing, de-risking, picking winners instead of picking the willing, and make it easier for those that are willing to move in a direction that can be under a common agenda, away from outsourcing to capacity building, away from working at but working with those in civil society, and this idea that actually unless we have different metrics, we had the TCU in the room today of how we monitor these investments, and we heard they have many more resources, many more people than those that they are monitoring. This question of evaluation is absolutely critical, because unless we have a different way to evaluate what it means to steer and tilt an economy to achieve goals, then it's actually almost impossible to repeat those positive experiences, because we end up misvaluing what actually happened on the ground. So thank you. God, I spoke way too much, but... You told me an hour.
Before Verena makes her comments, I want to advise you that we are going to have a piano after, yes, and then some salgadinhos to eat, okay? So stay after.
I should present? Okay, I would like to call to the floor Verena Hitzner, who is one of the great creators of our national innovation policy.
Thank you. Mariana, I'll be seated because I don't know how to speak and think and run and do everything together at the same time. I would like to think together with you about the things we have been discussing on the missions, but I would like to think considering a little bit about the political sociology behind the missions. I won't talk about our new industrial policy, but I would like to think about these issues because, in my opinion, we have to consider together as a society about the meaning of building a new development policy here for Brazil, which is put your theory in the Brazilian scenario, where we have our history on how we built our industrialization process, our history on how we built our universities, and our specific theories to explain why we need to industrialize since the 30s, 40s. Here we have Professor Ricardo Belchovsky, which I think is one of the persons that mostly theorized about these issues here in Brazil. And to think about missions in Brazil today means to think about the development, our development process, which includes to understand the meaning of the industrialization process, but also means to understand the importance of this process in the consolidation of our democracy and the building of our state capacities, because it's not that we have to build a new social contract. We have to build a social contract. And this, you remembered Luciano Coutinho that said that Brazil is a capitalism without capitalists, but the person who actually said that was Florestan Fernandes in the 70s. So understand this situation that we have in Brazil is very important to understand why the designing of the policy is important, as well as this political sociology that we are about to start thinking together. I wrote a lot. I'll try to skip some parts of the things I wrote, but I think to understand and discuss here in Brazil the role of the industry as a means to achieve development means rescuing the eclac reasons to let us to think about the process of building a more complex economy. According to the eclac theory, our underdevelopment is a consequence of the countries on the periphery of the post-industrial revolution is a concept for us of the process of development of the industry in other countries. I brought here what Furtado said. It's a process. The underdevelopment is an autonomous historical process and not a stage through which economies that already have a high level of development have necessarily passed. So we are basically poor because they are rich. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we have to understand and that we have to have as a basis to analyze the mission-oriented design policy in Brazil and what are the consequences for that? So I think understanding this process as a way of going through this situation of underdevelopment is, of course, as you said, to understand that the how matters as much as the what. But it matters not only for the results, but also for the process of legitimization of the policy. Brazil had a history that we started in the 30s, building our industry. In the 50s, the protectionism was the state. The state action was the way we decided to create our industry. In this meanwhile, we were creating our universities. They are new, they are from the 30s. And always the knowledge built in the university didn't join our industrial or our industrial process or our industrial development. In the 90s, when we started this new momentum of the capitalism, where the knowledge was an important part of the story, we started to disindustrialization. So I think now we have a new opportunity. Once we started building the Nova Indústria Brasil, we could do that, saying to the people, we are now building a new industrial development policy. And it's important. The missions, I think, they were very important to build our narrative, to construct, to organize our society, the university, the industrial sectors, the state, in the same narrative, for it to create first the legitimization, of this process, but also because we could build consensus in the society, to start thinking about a social pact or a social contract. So I think it was very important. What we have to do is the next steps are very important, because you showed us the importance of the instruments. I think Brazil has today a very strong state. We don't have problems with our instruments. We have to understand better inside those instruments, but they are here. It's different from the past, from the beginning of the century. And I think the process we evaluate our politics matters. And matters because when we decided to create those bold, ambitious goals, they different from the past, that we had goals only that generated responsibilities for the state. Now we have goals that generate responsibilities to all the actors. It means 70% of the total goods, all the goods produced for health in Brazil should be produced here inside. It generates responsibilities to the state. It generates responsibilities to the university, but it also generates responsibilities to the productive sectors. And the strength of our democracy, or the process of strengthening the democracy, means that everybody can sit together and discuss what works and what's not working in this process, for us to change the route together. So I I don't know. I just want you to explore with us a little bit more about this political sociology behind the missions. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Before Mariana answering, I'll take 3 questions from the floor, from the audience. Please present yourself.
Hello. Good night. I'm Jorge Ávila. I'm professor at Rio, and nowadays I'm the president of the Technology Network of Rio de Janeiro, which congregates the universities towards technology transfer and innovation. I have 2 short questions in there. The first one is related to the idea that the state can be a market shaper, the state can be a leading investor. Behind this idea, is there the idea that the state is in good hands, that the state is working for the common good, that our democracies are strong enough to resist to populistic attacks, to corruption, to all that bad stuff? How does this theoretical framework deal with these complicated issues? This is a rather pessimistic question. And the optimistic question has to do with Harari's Homo Deus, the idea that technology may make these missions more easily achievable. And what's the role of new technologies in this whole framework, okay?
Ricardo.
Eu sou Ricardo Belchowski, professor do Instituto de Economia da UFRJ. I have 2 curiosities, Mariana. First, who was more convincing? The Pope telling you to pray more, or you telling the Pope to take a better care of the Vatican? This is my first question. The second is about your audiences. I mean, you've been the audience, the kind of people, you've been talking to lots of people of different kinds, right? In universities, in governments, in the business sector, in the finance sector. Who pays a better attention to your beautiful framework among all these people? Who are your best followers?
So my name is Augusto. I'm from FGV. I'm assistant researcher, and I study development, management and development. And we study BMDS as well. And one of the things that I'd like to ask you is the process of continuity and change. Because when government change, usually they throw everything to the trash and then start to build something else, or maybe not build anything at all. The thing is, when the government change back, they don't start out what they stopped or where they stopped. They usually have to build everything again. For example, we are seeing this today, the things that we are seeing in Lula's government is not exactly what he used to do in the last government he had. A lot of things changed for the worse, and it's not possible to continue the things that got interrupted. So I'd like to ask you, how is it possible to assemble everything?
Thank you. I will take 2 more questions, but you have to be a woman.
Well, thank you so much for this brilliant conversation and presentation. I want to ask you the following. When you have as the horizon of public policies, public goods as a new horizon, you really need new state capacities to face, for instance, the SDG challenges. And if you put the common goods as the main objective of public policy, of policies in general, you need a new state capacities. And of course, we need to prepare the public servants to do this. And what will be your suggestions in terms of the preparation of civil servants? What should we teach to them? And one possible solutions will be your pizza chart. Yeah, yes. Because you have there some suggestions that could be useful for training new public services, for training the public servants in order to build a new capacity, a new state capacities. So my question is towards how to do the new capacity building.
Gabi.
Well, good night, everyone. First of all, thank you, Fred, very much for giving the two last questions for a woman. I'm coming from a conference where our minister, Esther Dweck, a professor of this institution, said that the state of the future is a feminist state and anti-racist. So now, so we are aligned. Thank you very much. What I was thinking, and I would really like to hear from you, is like our experience. It's very hot. Okay. Is it better now? Thank you. Here? Okay. What I've been thinking, and I wanted to hear about, Mariana, is a little bit on the line of what Verena said. Like, after the experience of the new industrial policy here in Brazil, NIB, there are two things that have been in my mind about the mission approach. The first is, you always say that the mission has to be bold, it has to be challenged, it has to encourage all society. But what we faced here is actually the political risk of putting a very high challenge. And I wanted to know if this also happened in other countries. The political do not want a very challenge goal. They want a very conservative goal. That's one issue that we had. And in the same line, they want a goal for the government, like in the 3 years. And we were thinking about 10 years goal. And that was a very that was very challenging. It was a very political challenge. We were thinking when we were doing the industrial, like a long-term goal. And when we were charged by the political of our bosses to think of short-term goals. I wanted to know if these process also happened on other countries. And also another challenge, even though you mentioned a lot that the industrial part that has the lobby that finds its way in the state, and of course when you do mission-oriented, where you put the society, the challenges of society on the center, sometimes the industrial, they don't see themselves on the new plan. And particularly in Brazil and Latin American countries, that is even a bigger challenge because sometimes if some sectors don't see themselves in the politics, we could have a coup. We can have like the democracy is actually very fragile. So that's also another strength, a pressure, which, so what I'm also thinking about the political aspects of the mission-oriented policy, like for the South, where the democracy issues are very central, where the government needs to prove to the society very quickly to legitimate them being there. So they have to have like very short-term goals and very concrete actions. And how is that? How that approach in South, I would like to hear a little bit of your ideas on that, and that challenge also happened on your other experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll pass to you. And now to answer the questions and to make your closing remarks.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for those wonderful questions. And easy questions. Maybe I'll take them not in order, because actually some are very much related. But also thank you so much, Vera, and also for the work you've done trying to make sure we don't get lazy. I think, again, I've learned a lot from you, actually, and over the last year that we've known each other. In terms of the political sociology, in some ways, all the questions that followed are part of that. So let's just allow that to be the wraparound. But even just thinking about, just moving to the one by Augusto about the continuity and the fact that, we get a new government, even Lula's own new government, compared to what he had before, that kind of short-termism that we often think is a problem in the private sector. The nature of the question is, isn't it also, if you want a question in the public sector, and it's actually related in some ways to Ana Celia's questions about capacity, because I think if in the end we're talking about a new mindset, a new underlying framing to even justify any sort of policy intervention in the first place, away from first identifying a market failure, it immediately puts much more pressure in terms of actually asking, what are we even creating instead of fixing? What are we creating instead of just regulating and administering and redistributing? And that capacity in the new kind of curriculum, Ana Celia, that you asked about in the Institute, we've kind of broke it down into 4 themes, because our biggest concern really is public sector capacity. The 4 buckets we've broken it down into are value. What is a new understanding of value? And value creation underpinning everything we've talked about. Collective value creation. What is it? If it's not just a production function with input and outputs, how do you take seriously that idea of, again, collective intelligence and relational value in a theory of value, which should underpin a lot of these things. Second, that idea of purpose. Now, what is a purpose-oriented economy? Galbraith, of course, wrote a famous book about purpose in the American economy, but that should actually be a thorn in the side to all those different actors. It's very easy to talk about purpose or vision or mission, but how is a purpose-oriented economy different from one that is really just leveling the playing field? All the words that we usually think about in terms of designing policy almost go against the notion of purpose. And instead of thinking of purpose as just an organization, purpose in a system, what is a purposeful ecosystem? What does it look like? What are the metrics that one then needs? And of course this, I'll come back to the issue of the dictator, the friendly dictator that decides the missions in a second. The third is creative bureaucracy. The work, as you know, of our good friend Rainer Cattell, who's one of my deputy directors, moving away from this idea of bureaucracy as a bad thing, actually really reinventing the kind of bureaucracies that we need to not just be agile and flexible, but again, be held accountable, even just admitting that any system will have a bureaucracy, and instead of thinking that we need to rejuvenate the mature corporation, but allow the state bureaucracies to remain kind of inertial as we've almost designed them to be, that itself becomes a big kind of part of the curriculum. And the fourth bit of the curriculum we have is around kind of design thinking, complexity, the ability to actually welcome those feedback loops, the underlying uncertainty in the system, the complexity in the system, that in some ways you, also in your question, Verena talked about. But I liked what you said also about what I call the dashboard, if you want, which really is just based on an article that I wrote, thinking out loud, almost to myself, of what the pillars should be of the common good, as you say. Each one of those, it's sort of like a roadmap, but it's each one of those pillars, actually, you can look at the traditional way to think about it, and what it would mean to actually, again, put some of these issues of, again, the collective value creation at the center, instead of thinking that we're always just kind of correcting the system ex post. So I do think actually the legal implications, given that everything ultimately has a contract behind it, whether it's the bailout schemes and intellectual property right, the water rights, the procurement contracts. Today, half the discussion we had was about the legal bottlenecks. I do think there's a huge opportunity to bring back the law. Think of Caterina Pistor's wonderful book, The Code of Capital, the code of a dynamic bureaucracy under, actually reinventing what are the new kind of legal structures that we need to actually enable, for example, that risk-taking, so you don't have to sell your house if you make a mistake when you're trying to, do the vaccine procurement in a different way. The continuity question, though, also is ultimately about, I became much more interested in mission-oriented organizations before mission-oriented policy. The fact that organizations like DARPA and the military-industrial complex often have been so much more ambitious than our social economy organizations was because they were actually designed to think in the long term. Because we care about those problems. We know we need long-term planning, not for national defense and sovereignty, all these things that become kind of militarized. There is long-term planning. There's much more stability actually in those systems. So we should remember there's a choice to be short-termist. And the DARPA model, which many people have studied, DARPA, as you know, was the Advanced Research Production Agency in the Department of Defense that basically funded the internet before the internet. They even funded Siri and all our phones and so on. They have a 5-year cycle. People are brought in for 5 years. It's not determined by the 4-year political cycle. That the head of DARPA isn't necessarily changed once you have a new administration. People are brought in often on secondment from other institutions and actually told from the beginning they will be measured, their human resource, their job trajectory, the career ladder is actually based on how much risk they're willing to take and how much economy-wide impact the few successes they have are. So, part of the continuity is based on actually retraining the civil service. So ministers come and go, but the civil service stays, with that new curriculum, but also the organizational structure around long-termism. We know how to do it, again, when it's around, as I mentioned before, war. It's just we don't care about the social problems, so we've allowed the social organizations to be so much more short-termist. The audience, where was there you are. Yeah, I mean, in theory, and I know it's much easier said than done, this should be a problem for the whole system, not? Given that each and every bits of the audience, including the universities, which have gotten all wrapped up in just technology transfer, so they want a piece of the pie instead of actually upsetting the way that we even think about the governance of our knowledge systems. If we think about the difficulty it should be for the bureaucrats, which very easily, as we've seen, come up with a bunch of missions, but then are not willing to deconstruct, to reconstruct their very systems. I'm using the words again of Mia Motley from Barbados. She uses that expression. The business community that so easily smiles and goes to Davos to talk about, corporate social responsibility or ESGs or purpose. In theory, if done right, for me, this was about my impatience with all those different. Each audience takes one bit of the story that they like and forgets the bit of the story they don't like. The bit of the story they often don't like is the socialization of rewards. Socialization of risk, fine. Socialization of rewards, no. And so, in fact, a lot of my current interest is what are the different ways that we can make sure that in a pre-distributive, not redistributive way, the results, the rewards of this collectively created value are truly as social as the risks taken. And there's many different ways you can do that, whether it's through equity stakes, the governance of our knowledge systems. Pricing, of course, is always important in terms of, if if we're thinking of, medicines and so on, but there's kind of, 30 different ways that you can make sure that we're governing a system to make sure that the rewards are maximized in it, that are a bit different from how we, have thought about cost benefits and welfare maximization principles, which start with the idea of everyone just maximizing their individual, utility, and then ex post looking at whether the system is kind of Pareto optimal. So I mean, for me, it's about being a thorn in the side, if you want, to all those different audiences, but my experience is each one takes the little bit that makes them feel good and just completely ignores the rest. And that's partly why I became more interested in saying, what's the underlying than just completely different way of thinking about the good and the common good that actually upsets even our way that we even comfortably talk about the public good and global public goods. The Vatican, who asked me that question? Where's the, you again, how many questions did you ask? The bureaucracy of the Vatican actually needs a course in a master's in public administration. Anyway, I think you asked that as a joke. But, sorry, I did take notes here. The question about, the kind of democracy bit behind this. Definitely, this is not about a technocratic, or elite way of telling everyone what's good for them. It's almost the opposite. We talk about these goals all the time. Every country has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals since 2015 and is massively failing. So really my work is not about, oh, we should set goals. It's, hey guys, we're talking about these goals all the time. Why is it that the system is failing? And the answer is we've designed that failure into the system by actually designing, especially, because that's my obsession, the public policy bit, as fixing the problem ex post. And so the question really is, if we are going to talk about sustainable development goals, first of all, how do you make them actually concrete so you can actually answer yes or no, did you achieve it, instead of just blah, blah, blah about climate? How do you make sure that that goal is truly upsetting the status quo of the whole economy, and that's the intersectoral bit, instead of allowing the sectors to call themselves the goal itself, and that's about changing industrial strategy away from the picking winners kind of captured side, but also about, and that's why I talked about communities and the city level, the local experience. It is also true that the resilience of the system, I think, will be much stronger when those very goals are negotiated in a local way, often in a contested way, hence the point about the labor unions remembering social movements have always been critical, because that means the consensus building is stronger. It's not just someone's idea, whether it's the UN goals or a minister's idea. Those goals come out of a struggle, which is much harder than to disrupt simply because you get a kind of a new administration. And for that issue of participation, both in the goal setting, but also holding the system accountable, that if things aren't going well, you better change that trajectory. Those kind of milestones become very important. But by the way, DARPA was very successful just as much in turning the tap off than turning the tap on in terms of the investments. But it shouldn't just be about these military DARPA kind of investments. If we're talking about net zero in a city, how do we stop doing things that are simply not moving in the right direction, and who holds that system accountable? I do think that the more we can think of, democratic fora like the experience we had in Camden with the resident associations holding the council accountable for how sustainability was being created at the community level, became something that I just realized we in the economics area actually had nothing to say. It was much more interesting to talk to the anthropologists, not just the sociologists, who have a history of thinking about empathy, meaning listening, which is itself a capability for the civil service, listening, shutting up, and actually putting yourself in other people's shoes and having those people design those policies, back to the point about the Camden care, social care, procurement, where the carers and the carees help design the outcomes-oriented procurement. But I think we should hear the piano before the piano player goes home.
Eu queria chamar, então, o professor Cliff Corman, está aqui, para que nós possamos iniciar. Eu não sei o nome desse querido saxofonista que está junto, você vai me dizer. O professor Cliff é da Unirio, e um amigo de longa data e um excelente pianista que vai nos dar a honra de... Está frio? Está com um pouco de frio. Como é o nome do...
Professor Marco Túlio vai me acompanhar, grande amigo e parceiro da Unirio.
Então, e vocês, se quiserem pegar uns salgadinhos lá fora, podem fazer isso, que eu imagino que essas alturas deve estar lá, não? Não, acho que pode fazer. Would you like to sign the book? Yeah. Outra coisa. Não sei. Quem quiser, por favor. Alô?
Caneta. Já tem caneta aí.
Pen? There you go.
Yeah, I had a really good one.
This is, maybe this is not.
Pick one, my Sharpie. Okay, I'll keep this like this. Guys, okay if I just sign? Is it okay if I just sign? Okay, unfortunately today. I know when asked me about the McKinsey. I think I wasn't supposed to mention it. Was it private?
No. I'll find that.